Okay, here we go. Dear ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are
Buenos
located.
días, buenas tardes o buenas noches.
One more minute. I think we have Spanish interpreter in English channel. Just a moment. I hope it's fixed. Apologies for technical difficulties. So today we will slightly touch on what gender is overall in our webinar, draw the line between the gender and sex, also talk about how gender is manifested in chemicals management, as well as how it relates to POPs inventories, and also we'll be able to listen to the introduction to the UNEP's gender guidance on NIPs and NUPs. And finally, we will have SCRC Uruguay sharing their experience from another project, but which is quite relevant to the topic of this webinar. And before we start, first of all, let me express our deep gratitude to all the participants, the countries and speakers for your time to attend the webinar, as well as to the regional centers for your coordination and support. And we are very happy to hear also from our regional center in Uruguay, which kindly agreed to present and share their experience. Thank you very much. Just a quick reminder, today we have 6 outstanding interpreters at our service, providing Spanish, French, and Russian interpretation. So please make sure to click the interpretation button in the bottom of the screen. It's an icon which looks like a globe, and select your language for your convenience. We are recording this webinar and we'll be producing 4 video records in English, Spanish, French, and Russian, so which we will send out to you and regional centers by the email which we indicated when registering to this webinar, and together with the materials which will be presented today. So it seems we are ready, and therefore let me give floor to project coordinator of component 4 of this project, led by GGKP, Ms. Melanie Ashton. The floor is yours, Melanie.
Thank you, Anastasia, and welcome everyone to today's NIP update webinar on gender and incorporating gender components and gender mainstreaming into the national implementation plans and the NIP updates generally. So we have 34 attendees here. So thank you so much for attending today. Please do introduce yourself in the chat. We meet often now, every 2 months on these NIP update webinars. So it's good to remind ourselves of who's here. So please introduce yourself and your country, and it helps us all get to know each other. Please don't forget, we have the NIP update initiative page, which we'll share the link to in the chat. There's lots of knowledge on NIP updates here that hopefully will assist you in developing your NIP updates. And please don't forget that we have the NIP update group on the Green Forum. We have 36 members so far, which means we have most of our project countries in the group. But what we would really like is that project countries think about extending this invitation to members of your national coordinating committees for the NIP update, because the information shared in here is useful for everyone involved in the NIP update in your country. So with that, I thank you very much for attending, and I very much look forward to an interactive discussion today. There will be time for questions and answers, and we'll continue the discussion over in the Green Forum group after today. So thanks, Anastasia. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for this and for the opening remarks. So our first speaker is Susan Grenfell, the Program Management Officer from United Nations Environmental Program. I hope Susan is back to us, because she was in another webinar and she informed us just before that she will be probably coming late. Susan, are you with us? Okay, I'm afraid that Susan is still in another webinar. Then again, floor is yours, Melanie. Melanie Ashton will be presenting and giving a quick overview on gender in chemicals management. floor is yours, Melanie.
Okay. Brilliant. Thanks, Anastasia. So Susan will be with us. She has prepared a presentation, and Susan is from the BRS Secretariat, and they're very busy at the moment, and she's at another webinar. So what we'll do is we'll just switch around the agenda a little bit so we keep to time. And when Susan's back after my presentation, we'll welcome Susan to the floor. So this presentation is essentially an overview of gender in chemicals and waste. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the presentation is to raise awareness about gender differentiated issues and impacts related to chemicals and waste management, specifically in the development of National Implementation Plan updates. So we hope that this is interesting and useful to your work. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about gender inequality. Of more than 1 billion people living in the deepest levels of poverty, women are widely to be considered the majority. SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 8.5, calls for equal pay for work of equal value. Current estimates suggest that the global wage gap ranges from 16 to 22%. But that's not in favor of women. UN Women estimates that 35% of women worldwide have experienced gender-based violence at some points in their lives. Next slide, please. So, as of October 2022, nearly 26% of all parliamentarians are women. This is up from 23% in January 2017. So we are seeing increased representation of women in parliaments. The Social Institutions and Gender Index in 2019 found that women had the same legal rights and secure access to land resources without exceptions for some groups of women and without discriminatory customary laws and practices as men in just 53 countries. That's a quarter of countries. Do women have the same rights and access to secure land? Next slide, please. So gender and sex. Sex is biological and assigned at birth. It's about anatomical and physiological characteristics. And gender is culturally defined. It's somewhat of a social construct. It's learned through socialization processes, and it's influenced by what society defines as masculine and feminine. It's dynamic, and it varies from society to society, and it evolves over time. Next slide, please. So, what are the gender-based constraints that limit women's contributions and agency? Next slide, please. These constraints include discriminatory laws and cultural practices. They include limited access to, use of, and control over resources. And they include a lack of decision-making power, that is, not invited to participate, or their voices are not valued in decisions. And this is why we look so carefully at representation, looking at indicators from representation in Parliament and that sort of thing. And we'll speak further about this as it pertains to the NIP Update project. Next slide, please. So this is something that I think it's very important for everyone to start to understand. And it's this concept of gender equality versus gender equity. And as we start to understand gender more and more, we realize that equality and equity are not the same. They're similar words, but they just don't mean the same thing. And once we start to understand the difference, we start to understand the importance of gender equity. So gender equality refers to the notion that every individual is entitled to the same rights, responsibilities, and opportunities, and that they should not be discriminated against based on gender. Sounds good. Next slide. Gender equity refers to the process of treating women and men fairly according to their respective needs. Now that can include taking specific measures to compensate for historical and structural disadvantages. Next slide. So this is one of my favorite slides. It really does show why equality in resources doesn't end up with equal outcomes. So we can say, oh, women had the same opportunities as men, but this infographic really shows why equity in resources leads to equal outcomes. And that means that you can see here, there's a lady in a wheelchair, and she's not going to have any chance in this cycling race if she's just has to race in her chair. But if she has if there's some corrections made, some considerations made to her starting point, and she's given a specialized bike, she can join the race. And this is conceptually what we're talking about when we think through gender equality versus gender equity. Next slide, please. So equity is often a means to true equality, and where the interests, needs, and priorities of every individual are taken into consideration, and the diversity among people is recognized and celebrated. And that's what we were seeing in that infographic, a diversity of physical abilities, and that was corrected. And then there's equity, which leads to more equality. Next slide, please. So achieving gender equality is not just about women. Men, vulnerable groups, children are all involved in this discussion. Next slide, please. Men are also subject to restrictive gender stereotypes about what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to behave, and this can limit their personal and professional life choices. So when we're thinking about gender, we must be thinking about women, and we must be thinking about men, and considering both of their needs and the restrictions they must be subject to. Next slide, please. So what is gender mainstreaming? Gender mainstreaming is a globally agreed strategy to identify gender inequalities and advance actions towards gender equality. Next slide. Women and men are viewed and positioned as equal stakeholders, actors, and beneficiaries, including for sustainable development. This serves the interest of both women and men in its long-term purpose of eradicating inequity. Next slide. So this is an overview of gender mainstreaming. You can see we start at neutral, and we can think about this in the context of projects, and our projects here, our NIP update projects. We start with gender neutral, and that means we ignore the social, economic, and legal rights, roles, and expectations associated with gender. So we do nothing. Gender sensitive means we're aware of the inequalities, as well as the different needs, constraints, and opportunities. Responsive means we recognize gender norms and inequality, and we create actions, policies, and initiatives in the work we're doing, including in the NIP update, to overcome inequality. Transformative examines and seeks to change power structures and the roots of gender inequalities, aiming to redefine systems in which the inequalities are created and maintained. And then gender equality is the state where everyone enjoys equal economic, social, and legal rights and opportunities, with recognition and celebration of all the people in all their diversity, regardless of their gender identity. Next slide, please. So what are the enabling conditions for gender equality and gender equity? Next slide. It includes institutional arrangements, and that means actively engaging the national gender machinery across sectors, establishing and supporting government gender focal point structures or systems, stakeholder engagement, supporting equitable participation and active engagement of civil society, including women's rights organizations, women's and gender-related groups, policy harmonization, integrating gender consideration and responsive actions, international policies, developing sector-specific gender strategies, policies, and action plans. Next slide, please. And also financial resources, ensuring that financial resources are allocated and that budgets are gender responsive. So we're looking for gender responsive budget policies and practices. And fifth, data collection and sharing, prioritizing sex disaggregated data collection across sectors. That means we're really noticing what's going on. We're measuring, and then we learn to start to improve issues around equality and equity. So sharing knowledge to enhancing understanding of gender issues. Next slide. So the focus area, coordination, engagement, and leadership. We want to strengthen cross-sectorial collaboration and engagement among stakeholders, especially with diverse and marginalized groups and local level stakeholders, for implementing gender responsive approaches in chemicals and waste management. Next slide, please. So how do we institutionalize gender in our NIP update projects? For a start, we can ensure that all posted positions and terms of reference target women and men as potential candidates. This sounds like a small thing, but what we've learned is that it's very important that people of all genders can see themselves in positions that are advertised, so they actually put their hand up and want to be involved in projects. Also, NIP Update national coordinating committees can mainstream gender through membership of representatives of women's organizations and representatives of ministries of women. Now, it's not enough to say we had equal men and women on our national coordinating committee and say, you know, we've got representation, we've got gender mainstreaming. Representation doesn't equal mainstreaming. And it doesn't, because we can't assume that all women are representing women's interests. So that's why we're specifically asking you to look at women's organizations, NGOs, peak bodies within your country, as well as representatives of ministries of women who understand what the agenda is for women and what the challenges women are facing currently in your country. And the other thing is development of gender sensitive inventories. And my colleague Anastasia will take us through more of that in her presentation. Next slide, please. So we welcome any questions in the chat box, but otherwise, I think back over to you, Anastasia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for the quick overview on gender in chemicals management. I think it was very helpful for us to refresh our memories of what gender is and how it is different from sex, and have a quick overview of how it is manifested in the chemicals management. Just one quick check. I think Susan is not with us still because we still haven't heard from her. So we will probably start with our next speaker, Mr. Fuat Bergigui. He is actually the gender specialist, international consultant, and he also co-authored under the UNEP gender guidance for NIPS and NEPS. I will be sharing the link with you in this chat. So he co-authored with the other expert on the Stockholm part in this guidance. And unfortunately, he was not able to join us today due to his personal circumstances. However, he kindly recorded the video, which we will be streaming right now.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be able to join this webinar today. Many special thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I will be presenting a summary of the guidelines on mainstreaming gender considerations in the context of chemicals management, which were developed as part of the support provided to the implementation of the national implementation plans under the Stockholm Convention. The survey conducted just prior to the webinar, the results show that 96% of the participants think that gender equality can contribute to delivering better results when we implement the projects that we have in the areas of chemicals and waste management. Another 93% agrees that we need more information on how do we mainstream gender into their design and implementation of the national implementation plans under the Stockholm Convention in our respective countries. That shows the huge interest that exists in mainstreaming gender considerations into our work. Let's start with providing the big picture. So by gender here, we talk about the social attributes and the opportunities that are associated with being male, female, and the relationships between women and men, girls and boys, but also the relationships between women and the relationships between men. So these attributes, opportunities, and relationships are socially constructed. We're talking about social constructions that are learned through different socialization processes. So by gender equality, we refer to the equal rights, the equal responsibilities, and also the equal opportunities of women, men, girls, and boys in a given development context. To give you an example, if we look into the projects that are funded by the Global Environmental Facility in the areas of chemicals and waste management, you will see that there is still some work to be done in terms of our ability to translate good project design into transformative gender results. So we have done quite good in terms of our ability to mainstream gender considerations into the design of our projects. But where we need to work more is basically how do we translate that good gender design into transformative gender results on the ground. So that takes us exactly to the strategy, which is gender mainstreaming, as the overall strategy that enables women, men, youth, and elderly, and vulnerable social groups and other population subcategories to equally benefit from project interventions. Here, we're also focusing on the fact we should not be exacerbating the underlying drivers of gender inequality in a given development context. So we recognize the fact that women, children, and men can be disproportionately affected as a result of their exposure to POPs. We emphasize, of course, the importance of equally engaging women and men as part of the overall package of solutions that the national implementation plans under the Stockholm Convention are striving to implement on the ground. So here we will focus on this presentation over the next slides on the key entry points for us to be able to mainstream gender into our work. So how do we do it? When we are developing enabling frameworks or enabling environments, it's very important to make sure that we consider some of the options we have on the left side of the slides. So we can use gender-sensitive wording when we draft our national legislation, such as laws, bills, decrees, and so on. We can seek gender balance when we form the legal teams in charge of drafting and enforcing different types of POPs legislations and regulations. We can assign special gender quotas when we design governance bodies, be it national committees, task force, and so on. We can provide gender training to legislators, regulators, and policymakers so they can be able to make sure that they understand the gender dynamics that are specific to the areas of chemicals and waste management. We can also promote science policy interface to make sure that we have access to 6 disaggregated data based on which we make informed decision making. We can also empower women to increase their participation into our workshops, events, and different activities of our projects through the use, for example, of ICTs and different innovations in cases where we cannot reach out to those women in remote areas. We can promote gender equality along supply chains of products that contain or are contaminated with POPs. We can also empower women through capacity building so they can equally benefit from any intervention, be it stimulus packages, be it market signals, be it behavioral change incentives that are being used in different geographies. When it comes to stakeholders engagement, what we can do basically is to carry out extensive consultations with representatives of different social groups, not just the usual suspect. We should try to reach out to the unreached persons. So here, basically, we can also reach out to women and men from different social categories. We can create enabling spaces for women groups and youth groups to make sure that they're able to voice their concerns and bring in their perspectives to the discussion. We can also ensure that women are equally represented, especially in different decision-making processes. We can engage women representatives not only from the formal sector, but also from the informal sector. And we can establish different communication channels that are gender sensitive, that are cross-sectoral in nature. And we can also use local languages so we can maximize the outreach, social media platforms, and other dissemination tools to make sure that we reach out to those most in need, such as workers' unions, family health centers, and consumer protection associations. When we develop inventories and monitoring, I think that we can seek gender balance when we prepare the TORs for different technical and managerial positions, when we hire consultants, expert negotiators. We can also upgrade the POPs monitoring mechanism so we can include the ability of such mechanisms to collect sex disaggregated and gender differentiated data. And we can definitely conduct gender sensitive POPs inventories to the extent possible, of course, by describing and documenting the differentiated impacts by sex and gender of exposure to chemicals. When it comes to alternatives to POPs, as countries are still facing different obstacles, you name it, whether it's the high switching costs, the R&D infrastructure that is lacking, the low human resources capacities, the lengthy reforms, and so on. What we can do basically when we implement NIPs on the ground is to ensure that women and other vulnerable groups are empowered to be able to benefit from such alternatives when they are deployed on the ground. For example, we can provide market signals to enable women to be equally represented in leadership positions and break the glass ceilings in different enterprises, companies that are developing alternatives to POP. So this could be done through a mix of policy and economic tools that countries are using to develop and boost their domestic R&D, research and development capabilities. We can also provide 6 disaggregated cost estimates of exposure to POPs to build a stronger case for action and make sure that we prioritize those that are most at risk. We can also enable women and men despite the social roles that are assigned to them. They can be caregivers or breadwinners. The idea is to make sure that they benefit fully from capacity building. When it comes to developing safer alternatives to POPs. We can also use context-specific approaches to raise awareness. Awareness is very important. Alternatives or innovations such as the use of field schools when dealing with farmers or locally hired volunteers when dealing with other community-based setups can be very useful in this case. When it comes to knowledge management, there are a lot of lessons learned that are generated by different projects, but this knowledge remains scattered. So the idea is to make sure that we collect all the pieces of the puzzle so we can see the big picture. What we can do here is to involve gender specialists together with policymakers and POPs experts in domestic and global knowledge management platforms. So these platforms are really kind of important to make sure that knowledge is shared and transferred properly. We can also build institutional capacities to walk the talk of gender mainstreaming. The idea is not just to have strategies on mainstreaming gender and strategies on gender equality, but also to be able to translate such strategies into action plan and concrete actions on the ground. We can also invest in gender focal teams. That's very useful because due to institutional turnovers, if we only have gender focal points in different institutions, when that person leaves to a different place, then you will have a vacuum. The idea when we build a gender focal team is that gender expertise becomes not only restricted to one person, but becomes diffused to a team of different people with the same expertise. When it comes to health aspects, it's really important to not just look at very specific health effects of exposure to POPs, but the idea is really to see the big picture and see the cumulative health impact, which translate into the real cost of exposure to POPs. To do that, we can establish multidisciplinary task forces to mainstream gender aspects into the environmental health research frameworks and protocols. We can also invest in gender-sensitive and sex disaggregated data, so we can better understand the interplay between sex, gender, exposure, and impacts that are applicable to environmental health research. We can also assess the cumulative costs of exposure to POPs, including the portion of the cost that is associated with the harmful effect on the health, on maternal health, and on children's health, the part that is transferred to future generations. We can also increase awareness about the true scope of exposure to POPs among the general public, so we can raise awareness and reach out to those most vulnerable groups. When it comes to the socioeconomic aspects, we can ensure that awareness raising activities are adapted to local context. What is most important here is to be able actually to really understand the dynamics in different contexts and develop not only one-size-fits-all campaigns, but really kind of adapt the language and tailor the language to different audiences. We can also look into opportunities to assign low-risk tasks to women of reproductive age in sectors and industries where workers are exposed to POPs. This will enable us to mitigate the health burden passed on to the future generations. We can try also to support investments in childcare facilities, so we can foster children's education. A child's place is, in a school, not in a facility that is dealing with different products that are contaminated or containing POPs. We can promote safer and greener alternatives to energy sources used in in households, which is the case in sub-Saharan Africa, where a lot of women and children spend a lot of time in indoors. And some of the sources used for energy indoors actually enhance or accelerate or increase their exposure to POPs, to harmful chemicals. We can also generalize access to social security services and see.
Sorry.
Traditional financing mechanisms. And in areas where we don't have traditional financing mechanism, or like women are not able to benefit from such mechanism, we can also explore innovative schemes such as the use of mobile money and digital.
Sorry, everyone. It looks like we have a problem with the sound of the video. I think we're in the last Sorry, everyone. It looks like we have a problem with the sound of the video. It's okay if we just proceed with the sound.
The idea is to make sure that gender is fully integrated.
Sorry about that. Looks like the audio is waving to us.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much, Jovita, for sharing. And we express our deep gratitude to Fuad for this insightful introduction to that part of the guidance that he developed. Just to let you know that Fuad is with us in Green Forum, so please feel free to join. And if you have any questions on that guidance, please feel free to drop your questions in the Green Forum and NIP Update group. And I believe Susan is with us already. Yes, Susan is with us. So let me introduce our next speaker, Susan Winfield, Program Management Officer from United Nations Environmental Program. And she's actually a gender focal point from BRS Secretariat. So today she will share with us the perspective of Stockholm Convention and some recommended actions with gender focus. Floor is yours, Susan.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I do apologize. I was a bit late coming from another webinar, completely unrelated to gender. So I'm kind of switching my focus now to integrating the gender perspectives into national implementation plans. To do so, I'm going to first of all share my screen. I hope, let me just see if this is possible.
Yeah, we can see that. Thank you, Susan.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much. So I've been asked to speak today about, well, really mainstreaming gender, and I'm sure this is a term that you've come across already, into particularly the BRS conventions, which, as you may know, are the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm conventions, and specifically integrating these perspectives into the preparation or review and updating of Stockholm national implementation plans. So I'll skip over this quite quickly, but just to let you know that, of course, the gender has been on the agenda for many years now. This just gives some entry points from the UN perspective, whereby the issues related to gender equality and mainstreaming have been really brought to the fore over the past 20 or so years. In terms of the BRS conventions, really the gender mainstreaming has become quite a focal area for action, I'd say over the past 10 years. Basically, that action really started with a first step, which was acknowledging gender impacts in chemicals and waste management. So really looking at the impact depending on your specific gendered role in society, the impacts that brings in terms of chemicals and waste management. The next step was really then for the Secretariat to take some action to inform our parties or the governments that have ratified the conventions of the different ways that gender is important to be considered within chemicals and waste management. And this really resulted then in the parties adopting a decision within our conferences of the parties, acknowledging the importance of the gender dimension in the environmentally sound management of chemicals and waste. One of the big milestones for the conventions was development of a gender action plan. This is something that many of the multilateral environmental agreements have done. If you're working across MEAs, you probably come across other MEA gender action plans, and it really brings together the main areas for intervention with respect to gender across the life cycle of the conventions. This is something that is also useful at a country level to develop a national action plan, but I'll come to that more later. Really, when we look at our gender action plan, there are specific actions for the Secretariat to take. For example, looking internally at our processes and systems to ensure that there is equality given and parity at all levels in terms of gender representation, through to how we conduct our capacity building or technical assistance programs, making sure that impacts on the different genders, that the needs of the different genders are taken into account. But when we're assisting our parties, what we're really trying to ensure through our action on gender is essentially the list I provided here, which is not only to educate concerned stakeholders on risks associated with chemicals, taking into account gender disparities, to raise awareness of the linkages, because still we find we've conducted training in various settings, for example, for our global network of regional centre directors at the party level, and there is really a differing understanding of the impacts that chemicals and waste can have on the different genders. So that's important to raise awareness there. We also want to encourage our parties or governments to support mandatory labelling of all chemicals, promoting a multi-stakeholder approach. And then you can, of course, see the other actions there. I won't read through them all. You will receive this PowerPoint after this webinar. But these are really the main goals that we're looking to achieve through the actions that we're taking on gender mainstreaming. Which brings me to the definition, which perhaps I should have brought up front. I imagine one of the speakers has already covered the definition of gender mainstreaming, but I think it's important to just revisit it, that it is this strategy that integrates both women and men's different concerns and interests in the full life cycle of planning policies, programs, updating national implementation plans, for example. So it's to make sure that those interests and concerns are factored in and action is taken in response at all stages of the project, program, review or update life cycle. So I maybe just skip over this, but just I think that we're already aware of, you know, how chemicals and waste can impact the different sexes, the different age groups, and so forth differently. And this is really what we base our actions in. But moving over to specifically when we talk about Stockholm Convention national implementation plans, we had under the Secretariat a number of years ago, perhaps 5 years ago, commissioned a study to look across the conventions to really develop a baseline of disaggregated data, looking across our programs, across things like representation in meetings, participation in specific working groups and so forth, to look at the balance in genders, gender representation. And one of those areas was actually to look at the Stockholm Convention national implementation plans. So this work was based on, I think at the time, we're probably going back to 2015, the data was taken from, we had maybe 170 NIPs that were on our records, of which I think around 150 of these national implementation plans were reviewed to determine, oh, sorry, I've got a problem here, apologies. What's going on? Sorry, my screen just went a bit blank, but oh.
You can still see your presentation, Susan.
Okay, yeah, no, it's just I'm looking at a different screen, sorry. All right, apologies for that. So yes, just looking across how gender considerations were factored into the development of national implementation plans under Stockholm. This is the initial NIP development. We saw that, well, you can see the percentages here, fairly low for things like inclusion of women's organizations in the development of NIPs, including women and gender considerations in NIP specific activities. Importantly, very low figures there for including any sort of budget allocation for gender and or women focused activities. So this, this doesn't paint a good picture, and it's something that in reviewing and updating NIPs now that we can seek to take corrective action. So again, same study, looking at the national implementation plans, we had looked at how women, for example, were referred to within the national implementation plans, and only 2% of the NIPs that were submitted characterize women as agents of change. Most considered them as a vulnerable population. 33% as beneficiaries of any action that could be taken, and then 35% as relevant stakeholders. So clearly what we want to be doing here is really bringing up the percentage in NIPs as they are updated or developed, to really give women more of a more control over not only the NIP development, but of course the activities and programs coming out of any NIP. Of course, it's important to identify the vulnerabilities of certain genders. It's also important to make sure that they have a seat at the table in terms of voicing their concerns, and also in terms of decision-making capabilities as well. So I just put this here, but I think it's probably redundant given the group I'm speaking to, the steps to review and update NIPs, which really comes from the guidance developed under the convention. I'd say that you're already partway through these steps, so I won't belabor the points in this slide. But I think at every stage that it is important to stop and consider where the gender dimension can be brought in with respect to the NIP update. I think from the steps demonstrated here, I mean, really the initial steps are going to be very, very important in ensuring that you have the gender concerns, a gender approach already planned before even starting the update process. So what does this mean? Well, across the NIPs, it's going to be important to initiate a gender analysis, which is really talking about the differentiated impacts of hazardous chemicals, specifically POPs, on women, men, girls, and boys. Next, of course, identifying gender-specific risks. So you're looking specifically at vulnerabilities associated with POPs exposure and other hazardous chemicals, essentially, so these can be built into the planning. And then mainstreaming gender into your NIP. We're recommending, and I'll come to this, I've got a step-by-step, I guess you could say, project management approach that I find quite useful to go through when trying to integrate these gender concerns at all stages of the project cycle. But just to say here that it's going to be particularly pertinent when you're looking at things like risk reduction, substitution, end-of-life management of POPs, and so forth. This, I think, was already touched upon in the last presentation, but the important role of women's participation and leadership when you're undertaking your stakeholder analysis, really making sure that not only are women factored in, but they are actually the part of the decision-making architecture of the review process. That is very important. Strengthening data collection. I think this is something that we can all work on. As I mentioned, the study on looking at gender dimensions of the BRS conventions, we only really established a disaggregated data baseline a few years ago, or 5 years ago. And doing this is crucial to really be able to measure the impacts of any action on both women and men. So this is an area where we're seeing more funds, more resources being put into to ensure not only the disaggregated data, which, as I said, you can plan specific actions targeted on that basis, but also measure the impacts of those actions too. Importantly is the capacity building and awareness aspect, which really is across all stages of the NIP update. Important to really make sure that at all levels of stakeholder, that there is that awareness of the different impacts POPs can have on the different genders. The last two areas where I think it's very important to bring gender to the fore are collaboration and partnerships. So I think you're going to, within your national settings, you'll have the opportunity to open up to many more viewpoints and experiences if you include, for example, grassroots organizations, go beyond what would normally be your traditional stakeholder bases to incorporate their experiences and and factor in the level of knowledge that they have as well. And then, of course, you've got to look at how you will monitor and report on how you're implementing the gender dimension into your national implementation plans. So next, I just wanted to go through what I see as really a typical project management cycle, because I think this really helps kind of at the various stages identify where certain actions are needed. Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened there. For some reason, I'm not able to see 6 of my slides here. Okay, apologies for that.
This is project management cycle slide, Susan?
Yes, it is indeed. And the issue is that you can't see the slides that come thereafter for some reason. My apologies. We're having some technical problems today, aren't we? Well, if I could just run through, I'm sorry, without the benefit of slides, but I think if you can try to remember the slide that I had just projected, which had the project management cycle, which really is relevant to any sort of project or program development, or in this case, update, review, and so forth, the various project management stages. There's those 5 stages. The assessment stage, or I guess you're going to be looking at initiation of the review and update of your of your NIP. And at that stage, you're really going to want to look at undertaking, for example, a socioeconomic assessment, particularly bringing in the impacts on gender, of POPs management within your national settings, and of course of any potentially planned interventions. We do have a lot of guidance under the Stockholm Convention, so at the end I will share a slide whereby you can access this. In your project design phase, which is really the second phase, I've been being very simplistic on the basis of your assessment that you've already undertaken. This is where you're really going to set your program goals and objectives, particularly integrating the gender focus in each of your project objectives. Similarly, with the implementation phase, you're looking at the impacts. You're looking at very closely linked to the project design phase, really, that each intervention has a gender element planned. And I should mention that very importantly is ensuring that there are adequate resources allocated to that particular intervention as well. Moving forward, when you get to the monitoring phase in your of your project management cycle, you really need to look back on the actions taken and analyze and determine the extent to which any gender gaps or gender impacts that you'd identified at the initial stages, to the extent to which those have been addressed, how equal opportunities or empowerment may have been promoted, and so forth. And then, of course, at your evaluation phase, you're really looking at taking on board the different outcomes that you've had with respect to mainstreaming gender, and then using those to plan ahead to the next to any next phase. So that could be, for example, your next review or update of your NIP. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've just been going on a bit too long. I will share this last slide with you to, sorry for this. Maybe it's easiest to go like this. Can you see? Oh no, that's not what I want to share.
It's okay, Susan, we can put the slide down.
Here we are. So just to show the different resources that we have, but as I said, I'll be I'll be sharing the slides, and you'll be able to see those missing slides as well. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan, for your presentation and for sharing the perspective of BRS Secretariat as well. Thank you for touching on this project approach and all the steps that have to be considered by the countries when incorporating the gender dimension in their national implementation plans. Just a quick question while you are still with us. We have been in touch with our regional centers, our executing agencies, and to the best of our knowledge, we have understood that there are no provisions in the budget to fund the gender expert or gender consultant. And we are just curious, because your presentation quickly touched on the gender analysis, and we're just curious, how should the countries be able to, what would be the recommendations for them to perform this gender analysis, given that there is no provision in the budget for that? Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. That's an excellent question. And honestly, we're having a similar issue, not that we're conducting an analysis at the Secretariat level, but we now have a gender action plan just endorsed by our COPs in May, and sadly, we do not have any funding associated with the implementation of that plan. So I do know the issues here. I do think that regional centres are a good place to start, the Basel and Stockholm regional centres. We're really trying to work more with regional centres to improve, essentially train the trainers where possible, although a lot more work is needed. I mean, they've had the initial gender training, but more work is needed so that they may be able to assist parties in initiating, these particular these gender socioeconomic analyses. For me, I think it's quite important to, and what we're trying to do is and I think what a lot of donors are trying to do at the moment as well, and as we know, there is a funding provision for the review and update of NIPS, is to really make sure at the outset that the gender dimensions are mentioned in any funding proposal that you're submitting to a donor for funding, and also to look maybe across more non-traditional funding sources. I know from our perspective, we would always normally go to the Environment Ministry for funding, but now we've started to look more across different funding sources. Those are really the some of the tactics that we're taking to really try and mobilize resources. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Susan, and we hope we can see positive improvements in this regard in the nearest time. Thank you, Susan. And we are moving to our next speaker, who is myself. Probably you know me from our regular webinars. My name is Anastasia Buchok, and I'm Senior Project Assistant working for GGKP. So I hope you can see my screen. Okay, so my presentation today will touch on how gender is related to POPs inventories and provide some insights on interventions in this regard. So before we start the discussion about the gender in NIPS, it's important to know that NIP itself is primarily focused on the POPs and their inventories, such as not limited to those that you can see on the screen: UPOPs, PFAS, P4A, PCNs, PCB, PCBs, and all others like POPs, pesticides. So gender itself is manifested in the need to reflect interests and rights of vulnerable groups of people affected by POPs and final POPs-oriented activities, so that NIPS not only present the information on the presence of POPs in the country and actions to eliminate them, but also account for the plethora of the context and settings in which these POPs affect population and provide solutions to ensure the gender equality and preventive measures for all the vulnerable and affected groups. Next slide, please. So in general, women, men, and all other vulnerable groups can be exposed to POPs through various pathways. So some factors that may contribute to this exposure, they include the occupational exposure. So women working in the industries where these POPs are produced or used, applied, handled, they may be at the risk of exposure, like, for example, waste pickers or women working at the e-waste dismantling facilities, or probably women working in the agriculture may also come into direct or indirect contact with the POPs during their work process. And also, it is about the environmental exposure. So POPs, they can persist in the environment for really long periods and contaminate the air we breathe, water and soil, and women and men and other groups living in or nearby these areas or regions with this improper waste management practices, they can be also exposed through inhalation, ingestion, or contaminated food or water, or direct contact with these POPs and services that are contaminated, and also the consumption of contaminated food. So we know that POPs, they accumulate in the fatty animal products and food chain. And so women and other vulnerable groups that consume the high amounts of these products that contain contaminated products, they also may experience greater exposure to POPs. Next slide, please. So the next one is the maternal transfer. We know that pregnant women can transfer the POPs, shall they have any, to their developing fetuses through the placenta, and also the nursing mothers, they also can transfer the POPs through the breast milk. So this is a huge concern from the perspective of public health, and also the traditional practices and cultural factors that we have to account that some cultural practices or traditional uses of products, they may contribute to a higher exposure to specific POPs, like traditional remedies, cosmetics, or cultural practices that have been, for years, like cooking, storing food in certain materials, or may result in increased exposure to some POPs. It's really important to know that the extent of exposure and associated risk can vary depending on geographical location, socioeconomic factors, individual lifestyles, other factors. Next slide, please. So as you can see on the screen, these POPs can be found in various areas, and they have several applications, but of course not limited to those that are listed on this slide, but I believe you know better. So it's agriculture and farming, it's public health, it's cleaning services, it's consumer products, it's electrical equipment, textiles, and also rubber products, adhesives, coatings, and others. All of these areas of application, they may represent a potential threat to women and other vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. So here is an extraction from the scoping study that was conducted by Women Environmental Program Nigeria and Women Engaged for a Common Future, WECF in Nigeria, and it aimed to explore the dimensions of implementing the various conventions in regard to gender and POPs. So this slide provides a quick overview again of how men, children, and women are exposed to POPs depending on their occupation, location, their cultural settings, and others. I believe it will be redundant to repeat this again, but just one example that was in that study as a particular from Nigeria is the household waste collection and sorting business, where women are frequently involved. Particularly, that was the case mentioned of the community-based household waste collection and sorting business run by young Nigerian female entrepreneur. And women working in this business, they potentially can be exposed to POPs during the waste collection and sorting activities. And also WECF reports that this informal recycling, waste recycling, men are normally observed to be doing jobs like melting plastics without any protective gear, no filters, like masks, respirators in the factory facilities, sites. However, women are likely to be sorting the plastics in the room next door, which was actually filled with the smoke from the smelter. So this was a nice example of how men and women could be exposed to the POPs. Next slide, please. And let us see how men are being exposed to POPs. So should we take a look at the agricultural sector, we can observe that men are perceived to be primarily engaged in pesticides application, working with pesticides directly. And therefore, men are more likely than women to receive the training about the measures, preventive measures to protect themselves when they're working with these pesticides. So this implies the knowledge about the need to wear protective gear during application, basic hygiene after spraying, like hand washing, bathing, and of course, changing the clothes after the spraying. They're also may also be using the vehicles, trucks, or cars to carry the POPs and store them in the field or warehouse, not in their house. And if women are involved in pesticides application in your country, please make sure that women are also invited to the trainings on pesticides and that they are aware of the preventive measures. Even they are not directly involved, they still wash their husband's clothes. And by doing so, they are being exposed indirectly. Next slide, please. So even though women usually do not spray the pesticides themselves, they are working in the fields where pesticides were sprayed or access these fields right after spraying, and they normally work for long hours. So moreover, women tend to have a low perception of an understanding of the risks which are related to the use of pesticides because of the poor access to information, as it was mentioned before. Women are not always perceived as direct applicators of these pesticides. Therefore, they are not always invited to the trainings. And also women tend to store pesticides in place over which they have more control. So it could be even the kitchen or the bedroom. Unlike men who could store the pesticides in the fields or in the warehouse. So it's also sad, probably you have read the guidance that was the UNEP guidance of NIPS and NAPS, and it says that women are not always invited to participate in the trainings about the safe use and handling of pesticides, which are organized by extension workers who are normally men. So as the result, women are exposed to negative effects of pesticides, and frequently they don't know about the toxicity levels of these chemicals and how they impact their health. Next slide, please. And this was a very nice example, which actually is presented in the documentary by WECF in Nigeria again. So we know that PCBs are normally used as insulation materials in transformers and capacitors and heat transfer fluids, lubricants, and etc. And in Nigeria, PCBs are actually banned. They were banned, but they still remain as hazardous POPs waste in all transformers, particularly the transformer oil that may contain PCB. And it was very shocking to hear that people in the country see the oil as a commodity. And there is also the demand for this oil. So this, in most of the cases, the people who are the buyers, they lack knowledge on its severe effects on human health. So PCB oil is being sold as a frying, instead of being treated, it's being sold as a frying oil for food. And female street food vendors, they use it to prepare akara, which is on the screen, and bean pancakes and deep fry other food. And in this way, women are exposed to inhalation of PCBs on every day with their kids on their backs. So we believe that women equipped with the knowledge on PCBs could still build their agency, but also adopt the safer practices, protect their health and protect their children. And even there are no PCBs and the mineral oil, which is another point of concern, it's important that women are aware that those oils are lethal, same as those that contain PCBs. So those should not be consumed and not be used for cooking purposes. So women must be aware that cooking oil and mineral oil is not the same thing. Next slide, please. And now we come to the POPs inventory. So given that one primary task of NIP is development of the POP inventories, one may be questioning like how gender can be manifested in inventory, because inventory is a technical thing. Is there any space for gender in inventory? So gender itself is not reflected in how we report POPs data in the inventories. However, gender dimensions should be accounted in parallel with development of such inventories. And in other words, like every inventory may also imply the outline of the context in which gender is affected by this POP. So data collection exercise for inventory development may also employ gender disaggregated data collection in parallel, which refers to the practice of gathering data that is broken down by gender. And it involves collecting information and statistics that differentiate between male and female in various areas that are affected by specific POPs. And at the same time, examination of the data through the gender lens will help us better understand the specific patterns, the challenges that are faced by women and men, girls and boys, and develop the targeted interventions to promote gender equality and also race awareness. Though it's not a part of inventory itself, inventory framework may also include gender-specific indicators based on this gender disaggregated data, which will enhance measurement and further monitoring of impact of POPs on vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. So having this gender disaggregated data, this data will be conducive to gender-focused analysis and identification of specific gender trends in existing POPs management practices or cultural patterns where the gender is manifested. Based on such analysis, it will be possible to develop relevant POPs management strategies and recommendations with gender focus and promote respective policies. And finally, the results of this inventory exercise can be combined together with the results of gender-related data to be further shared widely in academia, workshops, conferences, forums, knowledge sharing platforms, campaigns, trainings, and other awareness raising activities. Next slide, please. And finally, an important stage is development of the gender responsive action plan. So here, the gender considerations for an effective management of POPs can be incorporated both through planning and implementing strategies and by addressing the gender issues through strategic content. So the main objective of such gender responsive action plan is that it reflects the specific context, priorities, needs, rights of women, men, children, and other groups in connection with national strategies in chemicals management. So to assess whether action plan incorporates the gender dimension, it's necessary to ask the following questions that you can see on the screen for a self-check. So we will be sharing these presentations later after this webinar, and you also can find this question list in the UNEP gender guidance on NIPS and NAPS. So we will skip this, and next slide, please. So when it comes to recommended interventions on gender for national implementation plans, it's worth emphasizing that the focus on public awareness, that is really important. And several activities and approaches can be considered here. So we try to list the main possible interventions. First is awareness raising campaigns. So implementing comprehensive POPs awareness raising campaigns targeting women and other important groups of stakeholders. So this can help increase public knowledge and understanding of gender issues in chemicals management. These campaigns can utilize various channels depending on your context, such as social media, television, radio, and community events to reach to the wide audience. But the key here is to find the specific channels that would target the specific stakeholders group, or if better, all of them, women, youth, men, so no one is left behind. And also it's about gender mainstreaming. I will skip this part because I believe my colleagues have extensively mentioned on what is gender mainstreaming. And that is gender transformative intervention, which is worth mentioning. So these interventions aim to address discriminatory practices in chemicals management, stereotypes, beliefs, and they can be implemented through, again, educational initiatives, community dialogues, and advocacy campaigns. And also it's important to mention about capacity building and training. So providing training and capacity building programs on hazardous pulps, impact on human health, exposure of gender to these pulps. These programs can target various stakeholders, including policymakers, including unrepresented groups, civil society organizations, educators, and community leaders to ensure a multi-sectoral approach to raising awareness and fostering change. And finally, it was also mentioned by Susan, but I will slightly touch on this. It's national implementation plans should also emphasize collaboration and partnerships among government institutions, civil society organizations, international agencies, and other relevant stakeholders. So by working all together, sharing resources, best practices, information, coordinating efforts, comprehensive and sustainable approach to raising this public awareness on gender issues and POPs management can be achieved. And finally, I'm being mindful of the time. So it's important to note that the specific interventions and strategies, they may vary depending on the cultural context, priorities, needs, and of each country in the region. But national implementation plans should be tailored to address the unique challenges and opportunities which are related to gender awareness and equality within the respective context. I think I can finish here, and thank you very much for this. We will be sharing this presentation right after this webinar, and I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, who is Natalia Maciel. She is joining us from Uruguay, BCCC, SCRC Uruguay. It's our executing agency, and Natalia is here. She's a technical assistant working in the regional center. She kindly agreed to share the experience of their regional center, which is relevant to the topic of this webinar. Well, floor is yours, Natalia.
Thank you very much. Good day to everyone. It is a pleasure for me and for the entire team of the center to be here to share with you. I'm going to comment to you briefly on the work that we have been doing in this area. The work is being done under the framework of different projects. We are working with the support of UNEP, as well as with the support of different agencies that have helped us with this project activity. Basically, the objective of one of the activities of the objective is to promote the guidelines for the incorporation of gender dimensions and the establishment of our national strategies with the countries of the GRULAC region. We had two key activities. One was a webinar for all of the region to be able to share and promote the guidelines, as well as, on the other hand, to create a report on the lessons learned, as well as actual challenges faced with regard to the gender dimensions with our project. The guideline was developed by UNEP in 2021. We think that we already know about this, and it provides for us recommendations to incorporate the gender perspective in our national action plans, as well as our implementation plans, especially in the area of artisanal and small-scale gold mining. This was one of the activities that we carried out, a regional workshop for the entire Gurak region. This was last year in July. One part of this webinar was the gender mainstreaming with respect to chemical products, and this was focused on the NIPS. And during this training, we were able to cover very key concepts such as potential entry points to incorporate the gender perspective in the implementation of our NIPS. I'm going to share with you very briefly as well a summary of the key points that were treated during the presentation with our region. Some of the aspects were already covered by my colleagues, so I'm going a bit quickly. But this is, of course, it has to deal with the projects that we have seen in these last few years that, of course, have more weight, and of course, assign more weight to the implementation of gender equality, given that this is a policy of GEF that was adopted in 2017. And we wanted to highlight three key aspects. One has to deal with the fact that when we are speaking about the perspective of gender, we are referring to a general strategy to allow women and all our social groups that are part of our project can benefit equally from our activities, so that we do not exacerbate the already existing gaps between these groups. We also spoke about various times having clarity that women, children, and men are differently affected by their exposure to POPs, given the different assigned roles that they have based on their gender or based as well on their sex and the different general groups that they belong to. We also, in fact, emphasize that we would like to involve men and women equally when we speak about the solutions that our NIPS should provide. Here we wanted to speak a little bit about the fact that sometimes when we speak about gender equality in our projects, we don't only need to speak about men and women that participate in the workshops, but on meetings as well, as we need to understand that there are different perspectives that they can bring to us. For example, doing consultations, broad consultations with representations of the different social groups that are most at risk by exposure to POPs, including women and children. Make sure that we reach men and women of all the different categories of relevant stakeholders, not only from the formal sectors, but as well as the informal sectors that are exposed to POPs, and establish intersectional channels of communication that are gender sensitive. For example, labor unions, health centers, as well as consumer protection agencies that can work with us in this area. Sometimes we don't have that in mind. Other aspects that are important that we should have in mind is that we should assure that the activities that we are doing in relation to sensitization are adapted to local context, and that they include those most at-risk individuals. Strengthen or promote education of children, as well as deal with the problem of child labor, as well as that of access to social security services, including those for the informal sector, and to pay special attention to those vulnerable groups that are many times present in our projects, that can not only be just women and children, but as well as our workers in the informal sectors, refugees, migrants, persons who live in poverty as well. Here we have a short summary of the different entry points that have been already covered by my colleagues, but I will highlight some as well to create consciousness on alternatives, safe alternatives to POPs for women and other vulnerable groups. Look for equality, gender equality when we are presenting or preparing terms of reference for our different projects. Develop and strengthen institutional capacity to incorporate and to allow for this gender mainstreaming. Improve our monitoring mechanisms, and as well as have disaggregated data by sex, and carry out our COP inventories that are sensitive, that are gender sensitive. When we are speaking about norms and standards, it's also important to have in mind that our legislation should be worded in a gender sensitive way. And this would require including our legislators and our decision makers, as well as empowering women through the development of their training as well, so that we can allow them to benefit from everything equally. When we speak about our lessons learned and the challenges that we still face, we did a report within the framework of this project in the Glurlach region. And we did some data collection through a survey that was sent to all stakeholders. This is the survey that we sent out. And here I just wanted to highlight very briefly one of the piece of information that we received is that most of us have or are aware of the notion of gender equality, but many times how we can actually do this and how we can create this in our NIPS is still something that requires more profound work on our part. Here we have briefly some of the lessons learned, which have already been mentioned as well. It's important to guarantee that men and women of all ages are included in our project activities, as well as that we should empower those groups that are underrepresented so that their participation can be effective. It is also very important to work with those persons who are influential in our communities, who can assist us in promoting the agenda of gender equality. Can we go back to slides, please? I don't know if we can go back on the slides to the previous slides. Otherwise, I'll just comment for you briefly. Some of the other lessons learned is that it's very important that we should be able to include the gender perspective from the design phase of our projects, so that we can have it in mind from the beginning of our activities, because many times we leave this part for after, and then it is already a little bit harder to do that work. And it's not the same as if we would have been able to have it included at the very beginning. And after that, we just had some of the remaining challenges in the region. Of course, we're going to share this presentation later on with everyone. With regard to the challenges faced, we had that of being able to have institutional training to deal with this issue, as well as gender-based violence, which impedes women or prevents women from being able to participate in the activities. Another challenge would be stereotypes that we have based on gender. Problems related to the sharing and the lack of knowledge on the impact of exposure to POPs. And that many times these are the socioeconomic effects because the vulnerable groups are most at risk of exposure to POPs while they earn their living. And as our next steps, we spoke about what we should be working on in all of the regions, which would be the institutionalization of strategies for gender mainstreaming, being able to do a systematic analysis of gender issues, the development of action plans at the beginning of our projects, as well as ensuring financing to be able to work on the inclusion of the gender perspective and develop indicators that are gender sensitive. And there is where I will end. Thank you so much to everyone for your time.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for your time and for your insightful presentation. I believe it was very helpful to other regions and countries to learn from it. And we'll be sharing the slides together with all other materials presented in this webinar after. And just one quick notice, we are actually out of time, but we have received a comment in the chat from Ethiopia, and they're willing to share their experience and share the Ethiopian context in regards to gender. So for those who want to stay, we really welcome you to stay and listen, because it's a great chance to hear from your colleagues in other countries. And for those who are in a hurry, thank you very much for your attendance. And now we are going to give the floor to our colleagues from Ethiopia. That's Girma. Girma, are you with us? Thank you. The floor is yours. Yes, thank you. Oh, can we share the slides, Yovita, or?
Yeah, we can share. Just give me a
Thank
second.
you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Gilma, why don't you introduce yourself while Yovita is grabbing your slide deck?
Okay. Thank you so much, Melanie. Yes. Yeah, I thank you very much. My name is Girma Gammachuu. I'm General Director in Environmental Compliance Monitoring and Enforcement in Ethiopia Environmental Protection Authority. I'm also currently assisting the new project, the National Implementation Plan update, which is the second update for Ethiopia. So I'm going to share with you the experience that we had from our previous National Implementation Plan update, which was been in 2050, 2060. The final report was submitted in 2070 for the Stockholm Convention. So next slide, please. So Ethiopia's to see the context of the national implementation plan for Ethiopia, we are a country of more than 170 million population, and have 80% of the population which is living in rural area. And women provide the majority of agricultural labor in the country. So you can imagine that how much important to consider the gender perspective or issues related to this in the Ethiopian context. Again, we have 38.8% of seats in the parliament, which were held by women. This is the 2021 report, but previously when we work for the update of the national implementation plan, which is much lower than this number. And also we have gross domestic products accounts for 6% of the economy, which is related with agriculture. And also this highlights how much important to focus on the pesticide and waste management, which are the major priority in the national implementation plan. For a country like Ethiopia, having 46% of GDP related to agriculture, pesticide management and waste management is much of the priority. So when we come back to the national implementation plan in 2016, we have established a team the team which can identify the potential impact of persistent organic pollutant, focusing on like focusing and considering the gender. Then when we come to the implementation of some of the priorities of our national implementation plan, the legal and institutional framework development, such as guidelines, proclamation, both for the environmental governance and especially for chemical and waste management, has considered the gender mainstreaming issue in their part. Where again also we have also highlighted the importance of and core criteria of mainstreaming gender issue in evaluation of the project outcomes and outputs. To see what were our enabling activities, we have institutional arrangement where the gender mainstreaming issue is a key area, and these institutionals help us to mainstreaming gender issue both in our national implementation plan and the chemical and waste management issue. There are also high involvement of or engagement of stakeholders during the national implementation plan development. And this stakeholder engagement helped us to mainstream the gender issue, or to consider the gender issue in our national implementation plan. The policy backup, the national policy, especially the Ministry of Women use is their own national policy, which push the sectors to involve or to focus on mainstreaming gender issue in their development. So the other national gender mainstreaming guideline for environmental programs that's owned by my office. Currently, Environmental Protection Authority is one of the enabling activity or the enabling environment which made us to consider the gender issue in our national implementation plan. Please, the next slide. Yes, when I came to the POPs management or the national implementation plan context in Ethiopia, as I have said earlier, this is the second, the 2023 is the second update. We had NIP update in 2017 and NIP development in 2006. And we have clear priority areas in 2006 and in 2017. And one of our priority areas are pesticide management in general, the PCB, and unintentionally produced persistent organic pollutant, which is highly related to or need mainstreaming of gender issue in implementation process are our major areas. Next slide, please. So this is a picture which shows us one of the core activity which we have been working on the management of pesticide, which is the management of DDT in Ethiopia. We are now working on the disposal of this obsolete DDT from Ethiopia. When we first highlighted the importance of disposing DDT, one of our core criteria is this obsolete pesticide is highly affecting women, especially those who are working on this sector very closely. You might hear about the existence of DDT in human milk in Ethiopia. So that's why we selected the disposal of DDT from Ethiopia to reduce the persistent organic pollutant both from the global and national level. And our national implementation plan is not like a standalone plan, which is the integrated part of the national development plan. This persistent organic pollutants, pesticide management, and other waste management issues are highly indicated in our key performance indicator of national plan. Please, next slide. This is a photo which I take from the PCB management in Ethiopia to meet the 2025 Stockholm Convention deadline phase 1 by the management. Down there next to the PCB contain the PCB oil containing equipment, there are a community which is highly marginalized because of low access of affordable house. And that's one of the area we consider during the management of or identifying our priority in PCB management. This marginalized community makes us prioritize them to make them safe living there, even though we are not afford to make their household better or far from this accumulated site. So this contamination site is selected because of the very marginalized people, because of their low level of household, which is very close to the river. Next slide. And this is, I think, my final slide. This is the e-waste management. Now, Ethiopia is currently working on the licensing scheme for private sector for the management of e-waste, both for its environmental and job opportunity benefits. So in these private sectors, both women and men are working for its job opportunity and the environmental benefit, like I say. So in our general chemical and waste management and in our national implementation plan, the gender mainstreaming issue, and when priorities are identified, the gender and the gender issues are highlighted. One, by identifying the marginal community, and the second is by giving equal chance for men and women wherever they need it. This is our strategy and key areas of highlights we have in the national implementation plan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Girma, and the whole NIP team and Ethiopia. We know that you were actually active in the survey, and it's really highly appreciated. And we sincerely want to thank you for your initiative to present today. This is actually the interventions the type of interaction that we expect with our countries. And we also invite you to join the Green Forum and share some key insights from your key takeaways from your presentation with the group members. I believe they will benefit from that. And I think that our time is up, so we will be closing our webinar. Unfortunately, there is no time for closing remarks, but just one more time, let us express our deep gratitude to all the speakers, to all the participants from our countries. Thank you very much. Million thanks to our interpreters. Thank you for your understanding and staying with us, despite that it took us longer than we expected. Many thanks to our regional centers who supported us in every webinar. Of course, again, many thanks to project countries. And yes, anything, do you want to add anything, Melanie?
No, just a big thank you to everyone. We usually really try and respect time and don't go over, but we were so happy to see your presentation, Germa. So thank you again for sharing. And please, countries, if you do want to share in advance of a webinar, please just let us know, because we are so happy to include your experiences on the agenda. The webinar series is here to serve you and to share experiences. And I think Germa is a really wonderful example of doing that in the best possible way. So thanks again, and we'll see you at the next webinar in a couple of months. Thanks, Anastasia.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day, evening, and see you next time.
Bye. Thanks.
Goodbye.